Hello, my name is Nick Pizzo. I'm a project scientist at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and today I'm going to talk about the modulation of surface gravity waves by internal waves. This is work done along with Luc Linane, who's also at Scripps, that we've recently submitted to the Journal of Physical Oceanography. To orient us, this is a photograph Nick Statham took from a plane showing an internal wave which had propagated from the left to the right, and the surface current that the internal wave induced interacted with the surface wave field to create these rough and smooth bands. This project fit into a larger Office of Naval Research sponsored Inner Shelf DRI, which took place in Point Sal, California, which is a few hours north of Los Angeles. These are photos taken by members of the group. We can see convergent zones of flotsam here and here. This looks like some kind of front where there's enhanced wave breaking in this region. And then there are headland wakes that are visible too. We are particularly interested as a group in regions of strong wave current interaction because these areas can be significant for vertical exchanges between the air and sea, as recently been shown by Ortiz-Sislo and colleagues in 2019. As an overview of what we've done, we directly measured high-resolution directional measurements of the surface wave field in the vicinity of an internal wave. We found that the modulation of surface waves can be significant, and this offers a simplified case of wave current interaction at the mesoscale, meaning that the current feature here is on the order of hundreds of meters to tens of kilometers. This is a classical problem, it really goes back, observations go back to the 60s, but detailed direct measurements of the directional properties of these surface wave fields during these interactions still remain sparse. And so for instruments and methodology, we used a combination of airborne remote sensing from a manned aircraft using the instrument package we call MASS. This has been developed in this group for the last 10 years and is outlined in Melville et al. 2016 and employed in Linane and Melville 2017 and Linane and Pizzo 2020. There are a number of different instruments, including a scanning LiDAR to measure surface waves, IR camera to measure sea surface temperature. And then recently, we've been able to track thermal structures at the surface using a PIV-like technique to estimate surface currents. Along with these airborne remote sensing, this airborne remote sensing package, we also have in situ moorings, which have temperature, salinity, and current measurements as well. So as an overview of what we've seen, in the upper left, we have a CSK SAR image, which was taken on September 14th, 2017. And we can see that there's some structure here propagating towards shore. We have two moorings, one in 100 meters of water and one in 50 meters of water. And from those, we can look at the temperature versus depth structure. And we see that the water column has this internal wave here, which then propagates and is measured in this 50-meter depth water here. The black vertical line shows the time of the CSK SAR pass. And just a few hours earlier, we were on a flight track shown here with our MASS system. And the IR imagery captured the thermal structure of this internal wave. We can see the frontier, and then there's a series of crests and troughs. The environmental conditions during these observations were such that the wind speed at 10 meters was about 5 meters per second, and the dominant wind in waves were from the northwest. And the significant wave height on that day was 1.5 meters. So we can look at the sea surface temperature signal of these internal waves at two measurements that were taken about 24 minutes apart. And so the front of these internal wave trains is shown by the vertical black line here and here. And although that is approximately one-dimensional and just a vertical line, we see that there's quite a bit of transverse structure in these internal waves. And there's these horseshoe patterns that keep showing up, which are reminiscent of instabilities that show up in very steep internal waves. And those are significant because this seems to be the areas where you get upwelling from the colder, deeper water. So these might signify some kind of breaking event. We can take a closer look at the mooring measurements. We already saw the internal wave signature in the temperature field here, but we note that this also shows up in the velocity measurements. We see that the internal wave induces velocities that go all the way to depth, and they also have a surface signature, and it's this surface signature that modulates the surface waves. We can inspect the characteristic variables during these interactions. We already showed the IR imagery. There was also visible imagery, and we can see these smooth and rough bands, with the rough bands having quite a bit of white capping that we can observe visually. Chlorophyll A is also concentrated in regions of convergence, and we see that there's almost a factor 2 difference in this convergence zone versus in this neighboring region of chlorophyll A. But perhaps the simplest signature to see this interaction comes from the wave steepness, which is the modulus of the sea surface gradient. And we can see these alternating rough and smooth bands. This is sometimes called a zebra-like pattern, which is reminiscent of these types of interactions. We can look at graphs of these variables, which might illustrate some of these points more clearly. Here we have the SST, which has a series of critical points in the rough and smooth bands. The second panel shows the whitecap coverage, and it goes from some value to nearly 0 in the smooth bands. And again, we see these critical points of the chlorophyll A concentration reaching these maxima in convergence zones. Using the PIV technique mentioned earlier, we can estimate the surface velocity, and we find that it reaches magnitudes of nearly plus or minus 20 centimeters per second. At the bottom, we have a spectrogram showing the modulus of the wave number as a function of distance, and we see that the wave number is modulated by these currents, increasing and decreasing depending on which band we're in and which sign the surface or the internal wave-induced current takes. We call these bands S for smooth and R for rough, and there's 3 of each for this particular example. We can next take a closer look at the mean square slope modulation following some classical work by Cox and Monk. We partition this mean square slope into an upwind and crosswind component. Both are modulated by the presence of the currents, but the upwind downwind component is more severely modulated by these currents. It's interesting to look at the ratio of these two components. C here means crosswind, U means upwind. Typically, this parameter gamma is just a function of wind speed. That was one of the major findings of Cox and Monk. But here we show that the currents can severely modulate this ratio by up to a factor of about 3. It should be noted explicitly that at the altitude we're flying, the LiDAR can only resolve surface waves down to 20 centimeters per second, so that we're likely underestimating the slope by 10 to 20% for these conditions. And this is further discussed in Linnane and Melville 2017. So we can also look at the omnidirectional wave spectrum, and that's what we're doing here. S denotes smooth, R denotes rough. The black is the background spectra. We note explicitly that these bands have finite size, and so there's some low wave number cutoff here. And here is the spectral peak, and then we have this second wind wave peak, and we see that the rough bands have their peak wave number here increased, and the smooth bands have them decreased. And what's happening is in the rough band, the waves are extracting energy from the currents. In the smooth band, the opposite is happening. And we can also look at the ratio of wave action in different bands. And so N here denotes wave action, and the orange line is the ratio of the action in the rough band to the background band, and the blue line is the ratio of the action in the smooth band to the background band. And we see that these ratios can take on large values. It reaches nearly 3 here for the rough band, and that is significant because the classical way of modeling this, namely the relaxation technique, does not apply here because that assumes that this ratio is much less than 1. We can look directly at the directional surface wave spectrum. So the panel on the left shows the background wave spectrum, and we notice the classical bimodal structure of the wave spectrum seen here. And this basically means that shorter waves are more turned away from the peak wave number than the wave numbers near the peak wave number. And what happens in the smooth band is that the spectrum appears more isotropic, and that's because these waves are being turned more away from the direction of the peak wave number. In the rough band, the opposite is happening, and the waves are almost focusing, and you can see this angle of bimodality here is actually smaller than the one that's found in the background spectrum. And I invite the interested listener to also check out Linnane and Melville for more details about this process. So we asked ourselves a simple theoretical question, and that was, given information in the background wave field here, can we predict properties of the surface wave field at the locations R and S? And R here again is the rough band with the internal wave-induced surface currents opposing the direction of propagation, and smooth are when they're traveling in the same direction. And so we apply classical wave current interaction theory developed in the 60s and 70s. And the assumptions here are conservation of wave action. We have WKB theory, which gives us our geometrical optics. And we assume no coupling, no two-way coupling with the internal wave field. In order to make these predictions, we need the information about the background wave spectra, and we also need the phase velocity of the internal wave, as well as the magnitude of the surface-induced currents. But that's information we had from our earlier measurements. We're going to initially assume there are no source terms, and then we're going to use a model analogous to Challa and Kirby to model our source terms. So this is shown here. So we took from our earlier measurements the phase velocity of the internal wave to be 40 centimeters per second and the surface-induced current to have magnitude of 20 centimeters per second. On the left, we're looking at the rough band. The background spectra is shown in black. The rough band is shown in this orange color. And classical WKB is shown by this brown line here. We see that it predicts the spectral shift well, but then starts to diverge. And this is because of the well-known singularity that happens in WKB theory. This can, to a certain extent, be eliminated by either using a relaxation method or some kind of parameterization of the source terms, which is what we did here. And we best fit essentially an eddy viscosity and found that we could well describe the data. We can also look at this in the smooth band. Again, the background is shown in black, whereas the omnidirectional spectra in the smooth band is shown in blue. The brown line, the WKB, predicts part of the spectral shift, but then it overestimates the amount of energy in this omnidirectional spectra. And eventually this vertical line here is due to the waves being turned too much to propagate upstream at all. If we apply the same parameterization of the source terms that we did on the left, we find that we can, over some limited range, describe the omnidirectional spectra in the smooth band as well. And so it's clear that a more general theory is needed for higher wave numbers. This is going to include both the generation of waves by wind, but also some more esoteric ideas like the two-wave coupling between the internal wave and the surface wave field. But more importantly, there's some physics that's missing in our model, and that includes wave reflections and bound states, which some numerical simulations and theoretical work by Craig and colleagues and Hao and Shen show maybe imply might be significant for these types of interactions. And so I'll end with the slide I'll share during my lightning talk, and that is we conducted unique direct observations of surface waves modulated by internal waves. We found that surface currents induced by the internal waves can strongly modulate the surface wave field in both magnitude and direction. And we found that WKB and conservation of wave action was enough to predict the spectral shift for the omnidirectional wave spectrum, but it did not accurately model the high wave number behavior. So there's some future work that we are looking into. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. Please email me or ask questions on the day of the talk if you have any. Thank you very much.